Huh?
Hi, Amazin. Welcome to Many Questions, the show where we ask each guest many questions about themselves and mental health. How are you doing today?
I'm fine, thank you. Great to be here.
So, I guess to kick off, how would you describe yourself and why?
I would describe myself as an openly out queer Asian woman who happens to also be an athlete and an advocate. It's important to say all of that because that's part of my identity. And for a very long time, I wasn't able to describe myself as someone who was openly out.
Yeah,
And that weighed a lot on my mental health. So I always now show up as myself.
and we're glad that you do. Did you feel that coming out helped with your mental health?
Absolutely. Hiding such a major part of my identity. And, the LGBT community suffers such a high rate of mental health issues because of the lack of acceptance from society, from their community groups, from their family being pushed into a, societal normative box and not being able to express and be themselves. It weighed so much on my own mental health, just the energy of hiding and not feeling like that I could ever, show up as myself. It just added like I always describe it of having like 100 pounds on your back and walking
Yeah.
around with that, and the exhaustion on your mental energy from that non-disclosure. And it doesn't mean that you have to constantly out yourself, but it's learning to love yourself and feeling comfortable that you can be who you are, even if it's just inside of you.
Yeah, it's all about just being yourself, essentially.
Yes.
Why do you think there are so many issues affecting the mental health of the community?
One, there's a lack of storytelling
Mhm.
within the community generally. I mean, I look at myself, I never saw an Asian LGBTQ person growing up.
Yeah.
So it made me feel very alone in the world. And, when you're a child and struggling, just kind of finding your existence, but then struggling with this very different feeling that you have inside, but not being able to know what the name of it was, or how to describe it, or not seeing someone that felt the same as you, is just exhausting on your mental health. So that's kind of one aspect. And the lack of acceptance from society. I mean, you look what's happening at the moment with the anti-LGBTQ laws, particularly in the US and different
Yeah.
parts of the world, the anti-trans laws and transphobia. That's so much for a person to deal with. And then think about if that's a child, that layer of non-acceptance, the hate, and how it weighs on your mental health. And it's a progression of so many years of not feeling comfortable about who you are, not being accepted in society, not being able to be open at home or at work amongst your friends. And by the time you get to adulthood, of that build up of mental health and the issues that you may find. And that's why so many children and teenagers
Yeah.
into their adult years from the LGBTQ community have such high rates of mental health issues.
You'd think that over time, because the community's been around for, I guess, forever, but you'd think over time things will start getting better. But it just feels like we hit a point and it's getting worse. Or maybe it's just like naivety to feel like it was ever getting better.
For every 3 steps we take, there are 3 steps back.
Hmm.
And yes, we have got better. We have marriage equality, you have anti-discrimination laws, but then you constantly have to keep educating people. And depending
Yeah.
what happens in society, governments always use the weakest community or the smallest community as scapegoats. And you see that it always happens, usually happens with the LGBTQ community. You see it happening with the trans community. You have obviously an explosion of different communities that may not be accepting of the LGBTQ community. So there's this constant education that needs to happen. And that's why mental health research is so important, because you have to be consistently at the front of data of,
Mhm.
this is why we need policy change, because the data continually states that certain communities are constantly struggling with their mental health. It's not a one done deal, so to speak. It's
Mhm.
something that we constantly have to chip away at. So every generation, we hope that it will get better and better for them.
Yeah, here's hoping, definitely. So, do you feel like there's any problems accessing services for people in the LGBTQIA plus community?
I do, because one, maybe there's a lack of access of information. Two, depending, if you're in a household that's not accepting
Oh
of
yeah.
your identity or sexuality, then that could become a barrier to access of information. I mean, we saw it through the pandemic. People who may have had their work as a place of a safe haven for them from the LGBTQ community, but then suddenly were stuck at home for the next few years, maybe in environments that weren't so accepting of them, that could create a barrier to access of services or information.
So, what would you say are the biggest misconceptions about LGBTQIA plus community mental health?
Mm, that's an interesting question. I don't know why I'm taking so long to think of.
I mean, it's so broad. That's the thing.
It is. It's such a broad question. I think it's the lack of understanding of the multiple layers of mental health issues. Like, my mental health is going to be very different from a transgender person right now, because the anti-trans bills are directly targeted to trans people, and not necessarily me. You can't just umbrella us as one community. When you're thinking about mental health, lesbians probably have a different sort of mental health needs compared to gay men. And then this new spectrum of, the Gen Z and millennials, of how they identify. I mean, when I was growing up, we didn't have a word for non-binary. So I think that's the biggest misconception in terms of, the mental health research and data needs to keep up with how the LGBTQ plus community has changed to better understand the different layers of mental health and the best way to support each person within the community moving forward. Mm-hmm. And even looking into the future of how it might change. So we have some tools that we could start working on now to start supporting, the next generation of LGBTQ plus youth, because I believe the spectrum is going to get even wider. And within the next few years, there may be youth that identify and people identify in a way that we haven't even thought of. And their mental health experiences may be very different as well. Their mental health issues will probably look very different from the mental health issues that I, have come across and that I've experienced.
Mm-hmm. I guess you was talking about the tools. How could we support the community?
I think like ethnic minority groups, making sure that there's ease of access. I think for particularly LGBTQ people, there can be barriers of discrimination when it comes to accessing services, particularly from the transgender and non-binary community. So we have to create safe spaces so people don't feel uncomfortable to go to their service provider because they're not quite sure how they're going to be seen or treated. And you hear it so many times, particularly for trans and non-binary people when they're accessing health services, of the discrimination that they receive, particularly around their gender marker and being misgendered. And that weighs on someone's mental health because it's the whole part of their identity, calling them by their rights pronouns. Youth are coming out earlier in life as well. And, there is data to show that such a high percentage of millennials and Gen Z identify from the community. And, the straight community is actually becoming smaller and smaller. So we need to make sure within the school system, there's the right kind of mental health support for kids that are questioning their sexuality and gender identity. That's why LGBTQ history education is so important in schools. Absolutely. And Scotland was the first country to implement that, because I think of myself, how much it would have meant for me and how much it would have supported my mental health if I could hear about LGBTQ people when I was a kid and I could have seen someone like me, an Asian queer person.
Yeah. 100%. Yeah. Honestly, representation does wonders. I guess if you just don't understand what you're feeling, but you could watch a TV show. I mean, like back in the day, some of the TV shows weren't really the best, but at least you can see something to kind of understand a little bit, to get that grasp. But if you don't have anything, then you just feel so alone in the world.
It's very difficult. And it's not just children need help. I mean, we think of the business sector. So many adults are still afraid to be their authentic self in work, even with companies that do so much around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I speak to so many companies that struggle when it comes to the Asian community. They tell me that we've set up the Pride networks, we've made sure that our companies has a safe environment and exclusive, but still so few Asian people turn up to these Pride groups. And it's about, further understanding the cultural sensitivities and also, the mental health that goes along of how to best support someone who's an adult who has been struggling to be their authentic self since they were born, and that deep journey of mental health issues that has just grown into adulthood that they're still dealing with, that they may never have ever had any support.
Yeah, it just festers, I guess, inside you. Why do you feel like there's not many representatives from the Asian community at these Pride events?
There are still cultural issues in terms of one coming forward, the shame and failure of being your authentic self. In the Asian community, families tend to live, when you specifically look at Asia, but even here in the West, you have the child, you have the parents, you have the grandparents. So everyone is living on top of each other, and communities are very close. So everyone knows your business, and also that pressure within the Asian community to conform. But also, again, think of the last time you read the newspaper or turned on TV and saw an Asian LGBTQ person, either as themselves or as a character. So there's that consistent lack of representation. When the data talks about so many LGBTQ people, were at the athletics who are openly out, or so many LGBTQ people in TV and film, they're not talking about Asian LGBTQ people. So, that is even as an adult, you still want to see someone that looks like you as a reflection when you're reading the news, or when you're turning on a TV show, or when you're watching a film.
I feel like a lot of times when, I guess, companies talk about diversity, they don't mean true diversity. They tend to exclude Asian people. But hopefully, over time, things can get better. Well, thank you, Amazin, for this lovely, amazing conversation. I know that somebody out there is going to get something from it, and it's going to benefit them. And like we both said, representation matters, and I'm happy that you're, again, supporting more people with that same representation.
Thank you very much. It was so nice to be part of this conversation with you, Craig.
So if people wanted to find out more about you or reach you, where can they?
So I have a website, AmazinLeThi.com, and I'm on social media at Amazin LeThi.
Well, thank you so much. We've loved having you on Many Questions, and I hope you have a great day.
Thank you.